So I am chairing this session. My name is Rizwan Askar and I am from School of Computer Science. So just to give some introduction, these Gibbons Lectures are an annual series of talks supported by School of Computer Science, Gibbons Lecture Fund, Auckland ICT Graduate School, IT Professionals New Zealand, and Barrel Clear. The goal of each lecture is to describe detailed development in a specific area of research to a journal but a technical audience. The topic for this year is quantum computing. Quantum computers, as we know, are extremely complex. So given their complexity, it is very hard to understand them. It is also said that they can crack modern security algorithms. To this end, today's lecture is specifically on cryptography after quantum computers by Professor Steven Galbraith. He has a Bachelor of Computing and Mathematical Sciences from University of Waikato, a Master of Science from Georgia Institute of Technology, and a doctorate from Oxford University. He held research positions at Royal Holloway University of London, University of Waterloo, and the Institute for Experimental Mathematics, Essen in Germany, and the University of Bristol in UK. From 2001 to 2009, he was a lecturer in the maths department at Royal Holloway, University of London, where he became full professor in 2008. He joined the University of Auckland in 2009 and became full professor in 2016. He is currently the head of maths department. He is also a member of the Cybersecurity Foundry at the University of Auckland. In terms of significant distinctions, he is the author of Cambridge University Press book on mathematics of public key cryptography. From the University of Auckland, he was the first icon lecturer selected by the London Mathematical Society. He was also program co-chair of major international conferences, including Asia Crypt 2018 and Asia Crypt 2019. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Rizwan. Can you hear me all right? I take that as a yes, okay. So ko rangitoto te maunga, ko kerikeri te awa, ko pupuki te moana, ko Ngāti Pākehā hou, ko Steven Galbraith, tōku ingoa, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. So that was just me saying that I'm an Aucklander and that Rangitoto is my mountain and Lake Pupuki is my lake. But I did also live in the Northland for a while, so that's indicated by Kerikeri being my river. I used to live in Kerikeri. And I've been around the world and I've come back home, which is nice. There's a few sort of dedications here. I wanted to echo what Mike Deneen said in his talk last week, in particular remembering Peter Gibbons and Bob Doran, who I didn't know Peter, but I knew Bob quite well, so if you want to note his passing in the last year. I also want to acknowledge all the people that have supported me over the years and helped me through my career and given me opportunities, which is very nice. I'm happy to see a bunch of my students here in the room, which are also a huge part of my life as a researcher, I guess. So thanks to you guys. I also want to note the passing just this week of Robert McAleese, who was a professor in Caltech, who I never knew, but he's very important in this topic. I'll mention him later on. And I want to apologize to all my feminist friends for appearing in a program of speakers who are all male. Anyway, so what am I going to talk about? I'm talking mostly about cryptography and not very much about quantum computing. I don't really know much about quantum computing. But I do know a little bit about cryptography. And my current research area is this thing called post-quantum cryptography. Oh, that's not working. I guess I was never given a pointer, but anyway, never mind. So I'm going to mostly talk about post-quantum cryptography at the end. And I will occasionally put some mathematics in. If you're the sort of person that goes into a sort of a panic when mathematics is mentioned, these will all be temporary phases that will pass. So you can just go with it. If you've had too many wines and you're feeling sleepy and you're worried you're going to miss something, here's the executive summary. Quantum computers would break current internet protocols if they existed right now. But there's something called symmetric cryptography that still works, and there's something called public key cryptography that still works in the sense it's secure against quantum computers. So it's all going to be okay. That's the talk. So let's talk about cryptography and secure communication. How do you send a message securely? The obvious thing is you put it in some kind of locked box, and you send the locked box, and the person at the other end also has a key to the box and can unlock the box. That's a pretty sensible way of sending a message, and you assume that nobody else has the key, and so you assume nobody else can find out what the message is, or else they have to really break open the box somehow. Well, we don't want to send boxes around. We want to do things electronically, and so this is an Enigma machine, so the state of the art in the 1930s was you would have some kind of electromechanical machine, and it would take Morse code basically and scramble it up. But there was not a physical key, but there were some settings. The machine had certain settings, and the sender and the receiver would have to have their machines set up the same way. But we still call this the key. The key, what we call the key, is the way the machine is set up. And the important key phrases there is this word symmetric, which I put in brackets. It's symmetric because the sender and the receiver have to have the same information. It's symmetric from the point of view of information. The sender has some settings, knows what the settings are. The receiver knows what the settings are. And those two people can communicate. And the attacker is someone who's on the radio listening into this signal being transmitted and doesn't know the key, doesn't know the settings of the machine. Right? So that's the kind of traditional model of communication where you've got Alice and Bob, usually they're called. They've both got the same key, the same information, and they're transmitting an encrypted message, and the adversary is able to get their hands on this message but doesn't know the key. What do we do nowadays? We don't use Enigma machines. Nowadays we have something called the Advanced Encryption Standard that has been around for about 20 years, and this is what we're using all the time. And this is a symmetric scheme. It's an algorithm that is implemented all the time it's implemented in your web browser, and it's implemented on your phone. And it requires also the sender and the receiver to have some particular shared information. So there's the key. The sender and the receiver have a key, which may be 128 bits, or 256 bits, or 192 bits. And the sender and the receiver know exactly what this value is, and the sender puts the message through this algorithm and that transmits that ciphertext, and the receiver takes that information, puts it through the algorithm again, and gets the message back. There's things called modes of operation as well that I don't want to get into, but that's basically how a lot of communication is going these days. This is great. Symmetric encryption is great. But the problem is the sender and the receiver have to have this key. Now, if you think about security, there's often more than one thing we're trying to achieve. You might be trying to achieve privacy. You want to do something without people knowing what it is, or you want to send a message without them knowing the contents. But also, it's often very important to have authentication. You want to be sure of who you're talking to. Am I really talking to the person I think I'm talking to? So if you think about buying something online, you're buying a concert ticket or buying a book or a movie or whatever, you're sending your credit card details. You want those to be kept private. You don't want anyone learning your credit card details. That's a privacy issue. But you also want to know that the website you've logged onto is correct, is the right one. It's not a phishing attack, or it's not someone trying to steal your money. It is actually Amazon you're talking to, or Ticketmaster, or whatever. So you see there's a privacy aspect and an authentication aspect. Any questions at all? Everyone happy? Good. Right. So the problem is it's a bit tricky when you're doing your online shopping because, of course, you don't have a shared key. I don't actually have a unique 128-bit random bit string that I share with Ticketmaster or Amazon. I've never gone to their headquarters and tossed a coin 128 times and agreed on a shared random secret key that we're going to use for our communication. I don't have that. We don't have a shared secret. So how can I get this game going without meeting people face to face and exchanging random keys? And this begs the philosophical question, is there any way to send a message securely without the sender and the receiver having a shared secret? And if you think about it for a few minutes, it's not at all obvious whether that would be possible or not. Well, here's a thought experiment that will help you understand that it's possible. Suppose I put a message in a box and lock it using a lock that I have the key for and send the locked box. And now suppose the receiver puts their padlock on it, which is operated by their key that only they have, and send the box back. Well, the box is still locked. And now I take my padlock off using my key and send the box back, and then they can take their padlock off with their key, and they can. So there was no need for the sender and the receiver to have the same lock and the same key. The sender has one key for their lock. The receiver has one key for their lock. So apparently, you don't need shared secrets to communicate securely. It's pretty cool. How do you do this electronically? Well, you can do something just like this, where you perform some AES and send it, and then encrypt again, and then send it, and then decrypt. But then you would need some commutating properties. It can be done, but it's really not what you want to do. You want to do something in single pass. And there's this very important paper by Diffie and Hellman. They're not modest people. We stand today on the brink of a revolution in cryptography, and they called their paper New Directions in Cryptography, which is true. History has proved them right. Anyway, they realized that you could do this non-symmetric kind of thing. And this idea had already been worked out by people working in British government agency. So this was first, I think Malcolm Williamson was the first to have it, and Cliff Cox and various others. So the British secret people knew about this idea a few years before. But this is 1976. So around the early 70s was the first time people realized shared secrets are not necessary for cryptography. Okay, first a little bit of mathematics. Again, if you don't know what this means, don't panic, it will pass. This is based on exponentiation modulo p, if you know what that is. And if you don't know what modulo p is, but you're a programmer, it's the percent thing. The great thing is Alice can do some computation. She raises some number g to some random power a. A is her secret. And she sends this value, and Bob raises to some random power b, and that's his value. And they exchange these two values. Alice sends g to the a to Bob. Bob sends g to the b to Alice. And then they can both compute g to the ab. And this is a fantastic idea, and it's from that paper I put up. It's from this New Directions in Cryptography paper. And they're not communicating yet, but two people have managed to agree on a random thing that only they know. That's the point of this. Alice sends something, Bob sends something. Together they make g to the ab. Alice knows this value, Bob knows this value, and nobody else knows this value. So and once you've got that, you're almost there. I mean, that's basically your shared key. Very beautiful, very simple bit of mathematics, really powerful idea. So this more or less sets you up for shared cryptography. The other one that I'm going to talk about today is based on integer factorization, and Mike Deneen mentioned this also last week in his talk. This is the fact that you can multiply numbers together fairly easily, but it's hard to do the reverse. It's hard to factor a number into primes. I mean, these are just some toy examples. And going from there to the crypto system is a little bit tricky. The crypto system's called RSA, Reverse Shamir Edelman, and I'm not going to attempt to explain it, but it's somehow related to factoring. And the whole concept now is that you have, it makes it more clear, this idea of public information and private information. So the idea is that the product of the two numbers is public information, and the factorization is private information. So I keep secret the two primes, I publish the product, you can do some computation using the product, and I can do some computation that's basically equivalent to knowing the primes and decrypt. So that's this idea of public key cryptography. So there's symmetric key cryptography, where both sender and the receiver have the key, and then there's public key cryptography, where there's public information that you can use to encrypt, and there's private information you use to decrypt. So that's what I've said here. To encrypt, you use the public information. To decrypt, you use the private information. It's interesting, in the 1976 paper by Diffie and Hellman, they realized this idea could be used to solve the authentication problem, that you could prove that you're the right person using public key cryptography. And whereas the people working for British secret agencies, never occurred to them to think about the authentication problem. They were really concerned with sort of battlefield scenarios where you were sending information and they were only concerned about privacy. But in the real world, authentication is really important. Why is authentication important? Well, suppose your phone gets a little signal saying, please install this software on me. You know, please install this bit of code. It's fine, I'm not bad, I'm from Microsoft, or in this case, Google. Well, that would be madness, right? This could be a virus, or it could be any kind of bad software that could be trashing my device or stealing my information or whatever. But this is happening all the time. Our devices all the time are updating themselves. How do they know it's safe? How does my phone know it's safe to install all these updates? And that's because they come with this public key authentication gadget that's called a digital signature. So, and so an important point, I mean, we authenticate documents by writing a handwritten signature on them. It's clearly not really very convincing. I'm sure no one actually believes that a handwritten signature provides any assurance that the document is not forged. But it would be even worse electronically because you could just copy and paste. So a digital signature should be a particular use. You're going to send something like a message or a piece of code, and you're going to append to it some extra information, which is going to be the digital signature. And it's going to depend on the message, and it's going to depend on a particular public key. And it will be, you can verify it, you can verify the signature using the public key. So I can basically get this file and the signature, and if I know the public key of the sender, I can verify, yes, the signature is valid with respect to that key. I can trust this message. I can trust its origin, that it's come from the right place. And the way this works very well with things like phones is when you buy your phone, well, when you install the operating system, so in my case, I've got Android. So when I installed Android, it's got Google's public key already there when I install it. I install the phone, the public key for Google is already there. So when the very first update comes, the very first software update has got a digital signature. That to verify the signature, I have to verify it using the public key. But the public key is already there on the phone. I already trust the public key because I installed Android. So this is how you really solve this bootstrapping of authentication. You install once, it's got the public key. Every further operation needs to be signed back to that public key. If we didn't have public key digital signatures, we wouldn't have software updates. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, it's probably a good thing. You can do authentication using symmetric cryptography, but it's much, much more difficult to scale. Public key signatures make authentication really easy. And they're a really major reason why public key crypto is so important. So, internet, I really do need a pointer for this. Why is the mouse not working? Oh, there it is, it's working. Okay, fine, it was over there. This is what actually happens if you log on to a shopping site using your web browser, and you figure out how to get the security settings up. You will find a screen like this, and it carries all sorts of information on it. It tells you you're logged into Amazon, and there's something called a certificate. There's a certificate, and the certificate is verified by DigiCert. And what this means is this is really a certificate of authenticity. It's saying, yes, this really is Amazon.com. This really is Amazon.com. And that is being validated by a digital signature. There's a digital signature that says this is the Amazon website, and the public key is a public key coming from associated with VeriSign or DigiCert. So, which is the public key that's already in your browser. So your browser knows that this is the right website. It's not a fake website. It's not pretending to be Amazon. It's really Amazon because this digital signature authenticates with a public key already in the browser. So this is authentication of the website. And then there's connection encrypted using TLS. And there's a whole bunch of interesting things here, which I'm going to explain in great detail what they are. So this tells you that there's elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman being used. So that's this protocol I put up, this Diffie-Hellman protocol where you send G to the A and G to the B. It's a variant of that for elliptic curves. This is RSA, used for public key encryption, I believe. That's a joke, because Giovanni and I don't know what this is for. This is AES. I told you about AES right at the beginning. This is the modern day Enigma machine. This is your symmetric encryption using a 128-bit key. It's in a particular mode of operation called Galois counter mode, which is using a hash function called Shor as a message authentication feature. And the keys, it said, is 128 bits, which it already said there. So it's specifying all the little crypto ingredients that are providing this security package. So that's some of these are public key, some of these are symmetric key. And all this stuff is in your secure shopping and in your phones and in your internet, and you're using it every day. Anytime you log onto any website, you do your internet banking, you buy anything. Actually, pretty much every website you look at nowadays is going through TLS. And has got this kind of security features in it. And every now and then you want to connect to some website and it comes up with some warning, are you sure you want to go to this website? That's because this certificate hasn't validated properly. So this is what we're doing all the time. And there's a whole lot of mathematics in behind this. There's this elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman, RSA, all this stuff is all invisible. It's all here in your phone taking place. Wonderful world we're in. Okay, so that was the quick primer about cryptography and information security. Now we go on to quantum computers and quantum algorithms. And to me, there are two quantum algorithms of interest. There's Grover's algorithm, due to Love-Grover, which is something about search problems. And it solves them, if you had a classical algorithm that ran in time t, this thing will solve them in time square root of t, more or less. There's some question about constants and that, but anyway, that's the sort of headline result. And then something called Shor's algorithm that somehow does something about periodic functions. I'm going to say a bit more, and something to do with Fourier transforms. And this is more than just a square root speed up, it's an exponential speed up. And the headline result is that it factors numbers and it solves discrete logs in polynomial time. So this means it breaks the Diffie-Hellman protocol in polynomial time. So that's pretty scary for me. So I'm not going to explain anything about how Grover works because I don't know. But in terms of cryptography, what it means, when I talked about AES with a 128-bit key, what that means is that there's 2 to the 128 different possible values of the key. And if you wanted to break the cryptosystem, you kind of have to try every possible key. So if you're trying to break AES, you have to search through 2 to the 128 keys. And that's a big number. That's well beyond what any computer could do, even if it had been running for 13.4 billion years. It would still be well within 2 to the 128. So this is fine for current security. So I'll say something about this. All right. Grover's algorithm basically square roots the time. So instead of having to search 2 to the 128 keys, you essentially square root that. So that becomes 2 to the 64. And so I have some calculation that instead of 10 to the 29 years, it would take 10 to the 12 years to solve to break AES through a key search with Grover's algorithm, assuming that you can implement Grover's algorithm of the appropriate scale on a quantum computer and so forth. And this is, of course, still not feasible. 10 to the 12 days is still a long time, but it's definitely less secure than it should be because it should be taking 10 to the 29 years. I'm also not talking about parallelism here. Of course, you don't do anything in serial nowadays. You parallelize things, but this is just giving the big picture idea. So if you're concerned about quantum computers, and if you're concerned about Grover's algorithm, the safest thing to do is don't use 128-bit keys, go up to 256-bit keys, and then you've sort of undone the square root, and you're good again. So this is sort of the general safety advice, is if you're worried about Grover's algorithm, double your key length, and you're all good. It slows you down a bit, but it's okay. So it's a quantum algorithm. It's certainly impressive, but from a cryptography point of view, it's just a little bump in the road. It's like, oh, you have Grover's algorithm? Okay, I'll use AES with 256 per keys. So what? Not a problem. So Grover's algorithm doesn't damage internet security. Here's Peter Shor. So he's either the hero or the villain, I suppose. I mean, if you were someone who spent the last 25 years of your life researching elliptic curve cryptography, and you're a huge fan of discrete logs, like me, and then someone comes along and comes up with an efficient algorithm to solve discrete logs, you would probably think of them as the villain. But, you know, he looks like a nice guy, so... I'm going to say just a few words about Fourier analysis, which is a really beautiful piece of mathematics. And it goes back a long way. It goes back to Fourier, obviously, but even further, they kind of discovered this by doing things like trying to calculate orbits of planets and all this kind of stuff. It really goes back to very much applied mathematics. But what it boils down to, in some sense, is understanding sort of periodic functions. So what I've got here, what these two graphs represent, is this represents some kind of waveform, and this represents how it's formed out of kind of pure tones. So think about this being some instrument, and one of the instruments is playing a pure note, which is a sine curve like this, and then the other instrument is playing a sine curve like that, and what you hear, of course, is just the superposition of these two waves, which is going to look something like this. And Fourier analysis is a tool to get from the sound you hear to sort of reverse back and find out what the individual components were. And it's used in signal processing, and it's used in image compression, and it's used in all sorts of things. I was thinking about what are the algorithms that are most, the mathematical algorithms that are most used in the real world. It's interesting to think what actual mathematics is used most in the real world, because there's a subject called applied mathematics, and they do all sorts of stuff to do with solving PDEs and whatever. But I would argue that the things that are the algorithms that are most used in the real world are things like Fourier analysis and error correcting codes, that sort of thing. These are the algorithms that are actually used in every kind of electronic communication all the time. Anyway, beautiful subject, and it's really something about, I really want you to think about things like sine curves that have this sort of periodic behavior. They're kind of a pure, beautiful mathematical thing, and they repeat. But once you start combining them, things might become very messy. And you're looking to try to find this beautiful, pure, periodic structure out of something that's a bit more messy. That's what Fourier analysis is good for. So this is going to be the trickiest part of the talk, I would say. I'm trying to get towards Shor's algorithm. I'm trying to explain to you that somehow finding periodicity in a function is factoring integers. This is not at all obvious. So suppose I want to factor some large number n. N is a product of some prime numbers. I'd like to factor it. I want to find out what the primes are. What I actually consider is this function. So this is this mod again. This is percent. I take some fixed number like 2. I look at the function f of x is 2 to the power of x mod n. And this function is actually periodic. At some point, if I go for larger values x, it will start to repeat on itself. So there's actually a periodic function, which mathematically I write this way. So there's some kind of periodicity in this function, and believe it or not, this is not obvious. If I know what the periodicity is, I've won. I can factor, pretty much. This is not obviously clear. So somehow factoring a number n boils down to finding the periodicity in this function. So I could just try, forget about quantum computing, I could just try evaluating this function at some points. I could just take this function. I want to factor a number n. I could just choose some random values x and compute the function and plot them and try and find the periodicity in this function. I could do that, I suppose. And then I could maybe try and do some Fourier analysis on this thing. And there's a bit of classically, there's a real chicken and the egg. Classically, you basically can't see anything if you have the function at a small number of points in terms of really seeing the periodicity. If I evaluated the function at lots of points, I could really see the periodicity and I would win. So I can certainly factor numbers by evaluating this function at lots of points and seeing what the periodicity is. But that's not a very interesting factoring algorithm. It's basically the same as trying all primes. Or I can try and do something. I can try and do some kind of Fourier transform on the few data points I have, and then try and detect the periodicity from that. But that also doesn't scale. Unfortunately, classically, computing Fourier transforms is quite difficult. I was left to do exponential work. So period finding doesn't give a good algorithm for factoring numbers if you have a classical computer. But there's an extra gadget quantum computers have. They have a quantum Fourier transform, which can be computed efficiently in the sense that it somehow computes the entire Fourier transform in one go rather than having to compute each frequency individually. And this is really what Shor noticed. And now I want to come back to a point that relates to Mike Dineen's talk last week. There are different models of what a quantum computer can be. A quantum computer, there are different sorts of quantum computer and they can do different things. And Mike talked a lot about the D-Wave computer, and it was specifically designed, it wasn't a general purpose computer, it was specifically designed to solve a particular optimization problem. And it's apparently is good at that. It's not computing Fourier transforms, and I can't compute Fourier transforms using a D-Wave computer. I need a computer that computes particular gates. It's really a circuit model, and it needs to compute some Hadamard gates and what have you. So there's a particular model of quantum computing that's appropriate for Shor's algorithm, and that's the gate model, where you really have something like bits, qubits, and you're really computing some gates on these qubits and computing some circuit. So that's the model that Shor's algorithm is needing. So the idea is you take this function, you take its quantum Fourier transform by some kind of magic in the gate model, and then you do some measurement and you compute the periodicity and you factor. So, I mean, I'm massively oversimplifying at this point. But somehow the key gadget is this Fourier transform. How are they doing with these things? Well, they've done pretty well. They've factored 21, which may be a surprise, but that's 3 times 7. So that was a great discovery. And that's actually, as far as I'm aware, that is actually it for Shor's algorithm. That is the largest number that Shor's algorithm has factored. Using these other models of computers and a different algorithm, not Shor's algorithm, they've factored some other numbers. But these are not quite the size of numbers we use in cryptography. We're usually looking at 300, 500, 600 digit numbers in cryptography, not 6-digit numbers. So there's a long way between quantum computers as they are right now and breaking the internet.
Is there a correlation between the number of qubits you require and the number of bits in the encryption algorithm?
That's really complicated, yes. So the question was, is there a correlation between the number of bits? And this is a very complicated story I don't want to get into, but there's also a difference between physical qubits and logical qubits and error correction and how long the computation is running, and it's a highly non-trivial question, the relationship between number of physical qubits and factoring a number of a certain bit length. And I'm not an expert in that at all. But there are papers on that. Oh, another question? Yep.
Is that a function of the type of computing used? At the moment, it's pretty much it's the cryogenic, the free. But if you look, there's a lot of types that's coming on screen with the national.
Yeah, so the question is, does it depend on the sort of the engineering of the machine? And I can't, I mean, it's outside my area, I don't know. But I mean, for Shor's algorithm, you need the gate model, and I mean, that's what they've got. I mean, if it was easy to do better, then I guess someone would have done better. Yeah. All right, so let's look at our internet shopping when quantum computers exist of large enough scale. So let's imagine that we have an adversary who wants our credit card details and has as big a quantum computer as they need that can run in the gate model and solve Shor's algorithm and all this kind of stuff. What happens? Well, step one, do we know that we're connected to the correct website? No, we don't, because the certificates are relying on digital signatures, and digital signatures are relying on RSA signatures or discrete log signatures. So all the internet standards for signatures are broken by Shor's algorithm. So we do not have any authentication anymore of websites. We can't use elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman in the key exchange protocol. We can't use RSA for encryption. We can use AES, but maybe not with 128-bit keys. Maybe we'd stretch out to 256. We can use all this stuff. So the key length changes. So we've got a big problem. No authentication, and once you break the Diffie-Hellman, everything else is not private either. So we have no authentication and no privacy using current internet communication standards. If the bad guy has a quantum computer. People talk about bad actors on the internet. There were bad actors on the internet. I feel a bit sorry for the actors. I mean, actors. Anyway, never mind. So we've got a problem. Or do we? Well, this is the remaining part of the talk. There's a thing called post-quantum cryptography. What does it mean? What do I mean when I say post-quantum cryptography? I mean cryptography that I can still do today on my phone. It doesn't need new hardware. It doesn't need new communication protocols. I can do it over a phone wire or over a fiber optic, or I can do it over the mobile network on my phone. So it's current communication systems, current computing facilities, but still secure even when the bad guy has a quantum computer. That's what I mean by post-quantum cryptography. That's what my research is on at the moment. That's what these guys here in that row are all working on at the moment. There is another subject called quantum cryptography, which says we're going to communicate using quantum mechanics. We're going to have quantum states being sent down fiber optic cables or whatever. And that's also an interesting question, but it's a really different, you change the infrastructure and you don't really talk about internet protocols anymore, you talk about other things. So I'm not going to talk about that at all. I'm talking in this day entirely about classical computers, the internet as we know it, just substituting some of those algorithms with different algorithms. Now, the question is, when do we need to do things? So this is called Mosca's theorem. It's kind of a bit of an exaggeration. But the idea is this. Suppose you've got some information that you want private. Well, maybe you want it private today, also tomorrow. I mean, your credit card details last for a couple of years. Maybe you want your credit card details safe for a couple of years. Maybe it's something a bit more personal. You want them to be private for 10 years or 20 years. Or maybe it's some government secret you want to be private for 50 years. So any information will have some sort of lifetime during which you want it protected. So we call that X. And let Y be how long it takes for an international community of researchers to agree on a protocol and to get it standardized and then to tell everyone how to implement it and get all the software vendors to implement it and to get it installed in Android and Windows and get it rolled out on everyone's phones, even the old ones. And it takes a long time for stuff actually to get into the real world. So that could be 10 years. So maybe I've got some information I want to be secret for 5 years, and it's going to take 10 years for all these protocols to get developed, and then maybe there's going to be a quantum computer in 8 years. Well, then we're in trouble, right? Because in 8 years' time, our information is not going to be secure. So that's basically the question. And of course, X is an unknown because it's a personal thing. Y is probably about 10 years. And Z, we have absolutely no idea. So what should you do? Well, I guess you could spend a lot of time trying to guess what Z is, or you could think, well, maybe we should do something now just in case. And that's what's going on. So the NSA, who are a fairly disreputable organization, but anyway, people take them seriously, they announced in 2015 that US government agencies should transition to quantum-resistant algorithms in the not-too-distant future. And then in early 2016, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, so this is a US standardization body, which has a fairly ambiguous role. I mean, it's an international standards body. It provides a lot of guidance to the world about how things should be done, but it's also has a particular regulatory role in the US, in that it decides what are US government standards. So if the NSA says all US government agencies have to use X, it's NIST that kind of implements that, that decides what the standard is. So NIST, acting on the advice of the NSA, announced that they were going to start moving towards a standardization plan. But they do these open competitions. It's pretty cool. So they announce an open call for people to submit algorithms, and then they have a kind of an open public competition. So the submission date was late 2017. There were 69 accepted submissions. There was a conference in Florida that I went to. It was incredibly boring. Sorry, this is being streamed. Sorry, if you're there. My friends at NIST, I hope you're not watching. And then just earlier this year, there was the first cut of algorithms, and 26 survived into the second round of scrutiny. And then in a few more years, they'll be sort of whittled away, and at some point, a decision will be made, and a small subset of those algorithms will be declared as a standard and approved for use. And then they can be implemented and rolled out into the real world. And these are all going to be encryption schemes and digital signature schemes that work on current computers. So this process is ongoing. I'm not super involved in it. I didn't submit any proposals, but yeah, I know a lot of people involved in this. And so what's going on with these things? Where do they come from? So a lot of them are encryption or key exchange. Some of them are signatures, and they come from all sorts of different bits of mathematics. Lattices, coding theory, multivariate polynomial, whatever all these things are. What on earth can that possibly be? A strange word. Very strange word. Anyway, and some of these things have been around a long time. So code-based cryptography goes right back. Remember, it was 1976 was the new directions in cryptography. 1976, people said, maybe you don't need secrets for crypto. And then 1978, McLeish, who I said just passed away this week, he came up with a public key encryption scheme based on error-correcting codes. And this had no traction whatsoever. No one was the least bit interested in it for 30 years or so. But then they realized, this seems like we don't know how to break this using quantum computers. So suddenly it's got a new life. Same thing with this. It goes back to Matsumoto in 1988. No one was very interested. But yeah, so the point I'm trying to make is that I guess in the early 70s, a whole bunch of proposals were proposed for cryptography. And some of them, like RSA, were immediately successful and became used in the real world. They were the most efficient, looked the most secure, right? So they were the sort of the winners within the terms of the time. But then they're all killed off with Shor's algorithm. So once you kill off, the previous alpha top dogs, some of these other ones that have been ignored sort of come back up again and being looked at with new light. So some of these ones I'm saying, they're old areas of research, but they've got a new life. And then some of these things are very new. So the newest one would be this weird isogeny. I'm joking about it because it's my main area of research. Isogeny crypto is from 2006. And they've all got strengths and weaknesses, and some of them have large public keys and short messages, and some of them have short public keys and large messages, and some of them are faster than others. And you have to decide which one you're going to choose. Some you trust more than others, and so forth. So that's what this process is doing. The community is coming to some kind of agreement about which of these things is probably the safest bet for the future. So why doesn't Shor's algorithm break these ones? Why does Shor's algorithm break factoring? And why doesn't it break all the other ones as well? And there's a sort of a philosophical answer to this and a more pragmatic answer. And I guess the philosophical answer is a general statement in computer science. And that's that there are limits on the power of computing. There are always limits. There are certain things that are non-computable, or there's certain things that are really believed to be hard problems. So I'm talking about NP-complete, for example. There are problems that are believed to be hard for a classical computer. And you can bring in a new model of computing, and maybe some of those hard problems become easy, but there are always still going to be hard problems. There are going to be new problems that remain hard. So at a high level, you shouldn't expect Shor's algorithm to immediately trivialize every single problem. That's absurd. It's just an algorithm. It does one thing. And these problems are not within the scope of what that algorithm does. And it's essentially because they've got either less algebraic structure, so that applies to some of these things. This is a hard thing to pin down, but they're not periodic. They don't have the same kind of structure that arithmetic modulo p has. Or there's some kind of noise being used, and this is sort of messing up. There's an algebraic structure there, but it's sort of being messed up by some kind of noise factor. And that's lattice-based and code-based crypto. So these are sort of at a very vague level why we have new things that aren't broken by existing quantum algorithms. But this is not a proof. This is just a sort of a feeling. Now, I don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to very quickly, I want to give you a flavor of what a post-quantum crypto system looks like. So I gave you a flavor of Diffie-Hellman key exchange very briefly, and I really didn't say anything about RSA. But I'm going to tell you very quickly about this post-quantum crypto system that's believed to be post-quantum. And I swear this is the simplest crypto system in the entire world. There's never been a crypto system written down as simple as this. And I'm going to talk about this in the symmetric case due to lack of time. So Alice and Bob have a shared secret, and that's just a large prime number, p. So Alice knows p, Bob knows p, they have a large prime number. That's their shared secret. And Alice wants to send a message to Bob, and for simplicity, this message is just 0 or 1. But if I can encrypt 0 or 1, I can then encrypt anything by just encrypting a whole bunch of bits. And what does she do? She chooses some random q and some random r that's a bit small, and she computes p times q plus 2r plus m. That's it. It's just a number, just an integer. P times something random, 2 times something random, and the message. And all we need is that this something random is smaller than p over 4. And what does Bob do when he receives this big, he just receives some large integer? How does he decrypt? Well, he knows p, so reduction modulo p sort of kills off this piece, it just goes away. All you're left with is 2r plus m, and then that's just, you just look at whether the number's even or odd, and if the number's even, m is a 0, and if the number's odd, m is a 1. So you can decrypt by just sort of killing off this piece using modular reduction. So I swear this is 1,000,000 times simpler than Diffie-Hellman key exchange. This is 1,000,000 times simpler than RSA. This is massively simpler than elliptic curve, Diffie-Hellman, or any of these things. This is the simplest crypto system you'll ever see anywhere. We should teach it to high school students. And as far as we know, it's secure against a quantum computer. How about that? It was simpler all along. I didn't invent it. Okay. The system essentially is due to, they came to a very long way through homomorphic encryption. There's a way to turn it public key, which I won't go through. And it's not entirely practical, so we do better things. But that gives a flavor. I probably did just want to say, this is this idea of noise. So this is somehow the noise. When I talked about introducing noise to disrupt an algebraic structure, that's what this 2r is. I'm bringing in a bit of noise, and it just sort of messes everything up. That's at a high level. But anyway, I want to make sure there's plenty of time for questions, so I'll whiz through this. Okay, so this is the executive summary again. What do we do if the bad guy has a quantum computer? We can still use our traditional symmetric crypto systems like AES. We just choose a slightly larger key. No problem. What about the public key aspect that's broken by Shor's algorithm? Well, we believe we can substitute new algorithms, some of them very simple, like the one I just showed you, and as far as we can tell, they're secure against quantum computers. They're based on different mathematics, but that's fine, because people like me who have spent 25 years studying elliptic curves can learn some new stuff. That's okay, it's quite fun. So that's what I do now. But of course, there's no proof that any of this is really secure. I mean, there never is. There's never a proof. There's never an absolute guarantee of security in cryptography. Everything is based on some assumptions. So let's get back to the question of when do we need to start preparing, when do we need to bring out new cryptography? How serious is this question? So I looked up this quote, it's a famous quote, and apparently it's Danish. It's from it's not by Yogi Berra like I thought, it's from some Danish person in the 1940s that nobody knows. Anyway, it is difficult to make predictions. And I want to mention that there are people who say the whole thing is just a myth and irrelevant. There are serious cryptographers and mathematicians who significantly doubt whether a quantum computer suitable for Shor's algorithm at that appropriate scale can be built. I don't really have a take on whether their arguments are true or not. I'm agnostic about it. There are some pretty good discussions of these things by Scott Aronson, who's written a lot about quantum computing and is a believer, and Boas Baruch, who I think is a skeptic. But it's an interesting question. And I want to link that back to Mike's comment, Mike's talk, where he really talked about different models of quantum computing. I am not at all skeptical that people will build quantum computers that are useful for something. And they will do some kind of simulations and optimizations and possibly come up with cancer drugs and new superconductors and all that stuff. That's what a lot of people are working on with quantum computing. And that's very worthwhile stuff and could be fantastic. And that could all be true, and yet there is not a quantum computer that can run Shor's algorithm and therefore break cryptosystems. You see, there's really a difference, really two different worlds. So I guess time will tell whether these objections are correct and quantum computers somehow can't be scaled up for Shor's algorithm, or whether they can and it's merely an engineering problem and they'll be here within 20 years, like it's always 20 years away. The only comment I would say is when I first heard about this stuff in the late 90s, people said, oh yeah, we'll have quantum computers in 20 years. And they still say it's 20 years. And of course, the people who say that are the people who get very large sums of money from the government to build quantum computers. So they do have an interest in saying that it's going to happen. Whereas I, on the other hand, am completely unbiased because I'm doing mathematics of cryptography, and if quantum computers can't be built, I'll just carry on working on elliptic curves like I always did, and I'll be quite happy. So this is the end. If quantum computers can be built, then the current internet standards are absolutely inadequate. And this would have a huge impact. I mean, really, it's not just shopping on the internet. It's an entire system of trust that we're using every day that would be destabilized. We don't know if the computers can be built or not, but it's reasonable to be cautious and plan ahead. And that's why there's a lot of people studying these different mathematical systems. It's very active. And it's definitely one of the hot topics in cryptography at the moment, without a doubt, is this post-quantum stuff. So at that end, I'll thank you for your attention and take questions. So that's the first question over there.
This is all a bit worrying. Like the simple quantum resistant encryption algorithm you had, if it wasn't for the objection you raised, would be susceptible to Grover's algorithm. So this whole post-quantum encryption depends on no one ever finding an algorithm which is way better than Shor's algorithm. And people haven't tried very hard for very long, or even really had computers to try the algorithms on. Does this worry you at all?
Yeah, so I'm supposed to repeat the questions. So the question is, we're basically trusting on the problems that I've talked about, that we don't know any algorithm to break them, and we don't really know because not many people have looked at it, and it hasn't been around for a long time. And so it may be that some of these problems can be easily solved by a quantum computer. Absolutely right, that does worry me enormously. So the area I'm mostly working in at the moment is isogeny-based cryptography, and this image is a reference to it. And I have particularly exactly that opinion of this technology because it's really new. It's only since 2006. the mathematics it uses is really complicated, and there are a lot of people who are experts in quantum computing and quantum information theory and quantum algorithms. There's a whole community that knows that, and there's a whole community that knows about elliptic curves and isogenies, and there's pretty much no intersection of those two groups of people. There's maybe 2 or 3 people that know about both. And so you're ultimately putting your trust that the fact that, oh, you know, David Zhao and a couple of other people have thought about this and they don't know any algorithm. It's not convincing enough.
It might be really complicated, but really easy.
There might be something we don't know that breaks this stuff instantly. So yeah, you have to be really cautious. And that's why if I go back to the list, if contenders, so that's this one here, isogenies, which even though it's my area, I would be rather cautious about it. But things like the lattices and the coding theory that have been around for a very long time, they've been around 30, 40 years, and are very well known among the researchers in those fields. And it's been very well known that if you could find short vectors and lattices, whatever that means, everyone in quantum computing knows that that's a good problem to try and solve. So I get a much more sense of trust that these problems have been reasonably well studied. And of course, there's no guarantee, but I think you could start to use these with some kind of confidence. Yeah. Okay, so the questions about AI and AI running on a quantum computer and what sort of extra powers it could have. Actually, I don't know anything about AI or anything, so I can't answer that. Yeah, it's not my field. Yep.
Apologies if this is a dumb question. I guess the direct question is how many possible 256-bit keys are there? So if you have a very large key, which is the product of 2 primes, you get to a large key, you need 2 large primes. And I'm under the impression, they might be wrong, that primes become increasingly sparse the larger.
Okay, so this is a question about RSA keys, and if you have a large composite number, how many primes are there really that could be product? No, the primes get sparse, but they don't get that sparse. Primes are actually quite common. So this is actually important. If primes were too sparse, RSA would be useless because you'd never be able to find the primes in the first place. But actually finding primes is easy because primes are actually quite dense. So there are lots of primes.
How big is the
Yeah, lots. I mean, it's if you really want to know, it's if you've got a 2,000-bit number, which is a product of 2 primes of 1,000 bits each, there are 2 to the 1,000 over log 2 to the 1,000 possible primes, which is like 2 to the 900 and something. So it's lots of primes. This is Gauss's prime number theorem. Oh, sorry, Gauss's prime number conjecture that was proved by other people. Aha, yes. Could the US government, so if we were going to talk into conspiracies, in August 2000, so the question was, could there be a secret algorithm that somebody knows? So in August 2015, the NSA announced a transition to quantum-resistant algorithms. And of course, anything announced by the NSA is endlessly interpreted in different ways. So there are several ways to interpret this. Because it was really saying, stop using the current technology, use this new one, right? So is it because the old one's broken and they know it's broken and so they really want us to use the new one? Or is it because the new one's broken and the old one's not and they really want us to use the new one that's broken? Or is neither of them broken and it's just supposed to be some good advice? I mean, you have no idea, right? So this statement has been interpreted as a statement that elliptic curves are broken. It's been interpreted much more likely as a case that elliptic curves are not broken, but lattice crypto or something is broken. I mean, of course, I've got no idea. I mean, I don't know if there's... I mean, I would say that there's nothing in the Snowden documents that suggests that they have any super decryption capability. I mean, if you look at what came out from Snowden, which is sort of similar time, slightly earlier, everything they were doing was more at the sort of social engineering and inserting backdoors kind of stuff. The thing you do because you can't actually break the mathematics. So there's really no evidence that they have algorithms that are breaking mathematics. But what? I mean, you would never know, right? Any questions on this side? You're a bit left out of the competition. Ah, sorry.
With some of these different proposals that you've covered, that have been part of these competitions, what's seen as the relative difficulty of obviously not knowing all the possibilities of attacking them, but what's the relative ease or difficulty? Because the prime factoring was seen as a difficult problem.
Yeah, I mean, this is where it gets really hard, because it's like, how do you compare? So in this competition, so like I said, there were 70 submissions in the first round. There's 26 in the second round, and you've got a bit of everything. There's lattice schemes for encryption and for signatures, coding theory schemes for encryption, multivariate schemes for signatures, hash trees for signatures. This one died. Isogenies for encryption. And how do you compare? How do you say which is more secure? Is a 1,000-dimension lattice compared to a 1,000-dimension code, or a system of 1,000 variables? Which is the harder problem? I mean, this is why this is taking so long, because it's actually very hard, and people will just argue about it and say, "Oh, no, the best algorithm we know is this." And then, I mean, even it's actually much more complicated than it was with the discrete logs and factoring in some sense, because the algorithms, in particular this lattices thing, the algorithms we have, it's actually really hard to make predictions about their runtime asymptotically. They're very complicated, because as this problem gets bigger, you actually configure the algorithm in a different way. So it was very easy to say, oh, I can factor a number of this size and this time, and I can, if I take a 500-digit number, it'll be factored in about this time, and then I take an 800-digit number, and it'll be factored in about this time. You had a pretty good kind of curve of how these things would go, and we do not have that. We do not have it for lattices. Coding theory, probably better off. But a lot of these things, we don't have good confidence of how the security scales. So it's actually really hard. This is the biggest problem in the field. Mm-hmm.
The calculation is the likelihood of finding an algorithm, getting it agreed, and having the hardware to execute it on. Shouldn't that equation include the likelihood of finding an algorithm that works on the classical computers that breaks the mathematics? Otherwise, the equation is not complete.
Right, yes, good. So this is essentially asking about Mosca's algorithm.
Can you repeat the question?
So the question is about Mosca's algorithm. Shouldn't you also include a factor which is maybe the time it gets broken on a classical computer? That's exactly right. And I guess if you look at the current internet standard, if I go back to that, I mean, we already have this kind of calculation when we do our TLS handshake and we choose our elliptic curve parameters and our RSA key size and our AES key size. All these numbers are informed by current thinking about key sizes that are based on predictions about how long it would take to break using a classical computer. So all that kind of, I'd like to say knowledge, but it's really guesswork, feeds into that process. And when you're coming back to this quantum thing, you would certainly want this to be the time for a quantum computer or a classical computer to break the system. So yeah, I probably should have put that in. We should not forget that classical computers also exist and might break some of these systems.
Yes, but the actual problem we are trying to solve is witnessing an algorithm.
Yep.
New algorithms that solve the same problem in a different way.
It's still a classical problem. It's still a problem that could be solved by a classical algorithm. It doesn't have to be solved by a quantum algorithm. And in fact, that's what happened to some of these ones. I mean, probably the least successful proposal in recent times has been based on non-abelian groups, which is beautiful mathematics, but they've had real trouble turning them into cryptosystems because they will say, here's a cryptosystem, here's some parameters, this is secure against a quantum computer, and then someone will break it in 3 seconds on their laptop. And It's not a good look.
Resistant.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, it's a good point. Probably just about done, are we? Okay.
Let's thank the speaker.
Thanks, Rizwan. Great. Thanks very much. Thanks for coming along, everyone. Yeah. Thanks for all the questions.